There's a story the Lakota tell about the beginning of everything. Not the beginning of the world, the beginning of their world. And it starts in darkness underground, in a place called Wind Cave, beneath what we now know as the Black Hills of South Dakota. According to the origin story, the people lived below the earth in the time before time. They knew nothing of the sun, nothing of the sky, nothing of the endless grass that would one day define them. Then a trickster, because there's always a trickster in these stories, told them about a world above. A world where buffalo covered the plains so thick you couldn't see the ground between them, where the hunting was easy and life was abundant, and the people believed him. They climbed up through Wind Cave and emerged, blinking into the light of the surface world. This wasn't just mythology for the Lakota. This was history. This was truth. And here's what gets me about that story. Whether you believe it literally or see it as metaphor, it captures something essential about who these people would become. They were wanderers, seekers, people willing to leave everything they knew to chase a promise of something better. Now, the archaeological record tells us a different story about origins, but one that's no less dramatic. Around the 1600s, the people who would become the Lakota were living in the woodlands near the headwaters of the Mississippi River. They were forest people, canoe people. They hunted deer, gathered wild rice, and lived in permanent villages surrounded by trees. They called themselves the Oseti-Sakowin, the Seven Council Fires, 7 bands united by language, culture, and kinship. But pressure was building. Other tribes, armed with European weapons and driven by the fur trade, were pushing westward. The Lakota had a choice: fight an unwinnable war for diminishing woodland resources or move. And they moved, westward, always westward, following the setting sun towards something they couldn't yet imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The migration took generations. Think about what that means. No single person saw the beginning and end of this journey. Children heard stories from grandparents about the forest homeland they'd never see. And slowly, band by band, the 7 council fires pushed out of the woodlands and onto the edges of the Great Plains. And the plains, imagine seeing them for the first time if you're a forest person. You're used to horizons measured in dozens of yards, limited by tree trunks and undergrowth. You step out of the last river valley, and suddenly the world just opens. Grass stretching to the edge of the sky in every direction. Wind that never stops. A dome of blue so vast it makes you dizzy. Some of those first Lakota to see the plains must have been terrified. Others must have felt something else entirely. Freedom, maybe. Possibility. But here's the thing, the plains in the late 1600s were already occupied. The Arikara controlled the Missouri River villages. The Crow claimed the Powder River country. The Cheyenne and Arapaho dominated the Central Plains. And all of them had one massive advantage: horses. The Spanish had brought horses to the Americas in the 1500s. By the 1600s, they'd spread north through trade and theft, moving from tribe to tribe, transforming everything they touched. And when the Lakota first encountered horses, probably captured or traded from southern tribes around 1700, they called them Sunka Wakan, holy dogs. There's a moment in history, brief, shining, probably impossible to sustain, but magnificent while it lasted, when the Lakota stood at the absolute pinnacle of their power. Between 1750 and 1850, roughly a century, they controlled an empire of grass that stretched from the Missouri River to the Bighorn Mountains. And when I say empire, I mean it. They dominated the northern Great Plains the way Rome dominated the Mediterranean. Through military prowess, strategic alliances, and an economic system built on the most valuable resource in their world: buffalo. Let's talk about what summer meant to the Lakota during this golden age. By June, the scattered bands that had wintered separately in protected river valleys would begin converging on predetermined gathering sites. Imagine watching this happen. First, a few dozen lodges appear on the prairie, then a few dozen more, then hundreds. Within days, a temporary city of 3,000 or 4,000 people materializes where there was nothing but grass and wind. These weren't random camps. They were circles, the sacred hoop, with openings facing east to greet the rising sun. Family lodges clustered together. The council lodge stood at the center, and everywhere you looked there were horses. Thousands of horses grazing on the surrounding prairie, guarded by young boys who took their responsibilities seriously because losing horses to enemy raiders brought shame on the whole family. The camps buzzed with activity. Women worked tanning buffalo hides, using a process that took days of labor, scraping, stretching, working the hide with a mixture of buffalo brains and fat until it became supple leather. And yes, you heard that right, buffalo brains. They contain oils that, when worked into the hide, create leather so soft you could mistake it for fabric. A skilled woman could produce a hide worth 2 horses in trade. That's real wealth. That's economic power. Meanwhile, the men prepared for the sun dance. Now, this is where we need to be careful, because the sun dance has been romanticized and misunderstood probably more than any other Native American ceremony. It wasn't savage. It wasn't mindless. It was one of the most profound religious experiences in human culture, and it required preparation, discipline, and a kind of courage that most of us can't imagine. The sun dance lasted 4 days, sometimes longer. Participants fasted, no food, no water, under the brutal Dakota summer sun. They danced continuously, staring at the sun until their vision blurred and the world started to break apart around them. And some warriors, the bravest or most desperate, chose to pierce. Here's how that worked. A holy man, using a bone awl or sharp knife, would cut 2 slits in the warrior's chest muscles. Through each slit he'd insert a wooden skewer made from eagle bone, and eagles were sacred, so this wasn't just any stick. Rawhide ropes connected the skewers to the sacred tree at the center of the dance circle. Then the warrior would lean back, putting his full weight on the ropes and dance. Dance while the skewers pulled against his flesh. Dance while blood ran down his chest. And sometimes for hours until the flesh finally tore free. Why? Why would anyone do this? Because they were praying, making an offering of the only thing that was truly theirs, their own flesh, their own pain. They were seeking visions, asking for guidance, praying for the people. Warriors pierced before going to war, asking for protection. Fathers pierced when children were sick, offering their pain in exchange for healing. This wasn't barbarism. This was devotion. Red Cloud's father, we don't know his name, which is frustrating, but we know he was an Oglala war leader of some reputation, pierced multiple times during his life. One account says he danced until he collapsed from blood loss and dehydration, and in his vision he saw himself leading warriors to victory against the Pawnee. 3 weeks later he did exactly that, bringing home 50 captured horses and establishing his reputation. Coincidence? Maybe, but try telling that to someone who just danced with eagle bones through their chest for the better part of a day. The sun dance served another purpose beyond the spiritual. It unified the bands. For those few weeks in summer, the Oglala and Brule and Hunkpapa weren't separate groups. They were one people, sharing ceremonies, arranging marriages, settling disputes, and planning the year's major buffalo hunts and military campaigns. The Council of Chiefs and Elders made decisions that affected the entire nation. Young warriors from different bands competed in games and races, building relationships that would last lifetimes. And the women, we need to talk about the women, because they're often invisible in the warrior-focused narratives, and that's a massive oversight. Lakota women owned the lodges. They owned the household goods. When a couple divorced, which was common and carried no particular stigma, the man left with basically his weapons and his horse, and the woman kept everything else. The lodge, the food stores, the tools, the children. Women controlled wealth in ways that would surprise most Americans at the time. A woman known for her quill work or beadwork could accumulate significant resources. She could own dozens of horses. She could have multiple lodges. She could be consulted by chiefs on matters of diplomacy and war because intelligence and wisdom weren't considered male traits in Lakota culture. They were human traits. The quill work these women produced wasn't just decorative. It was art, it was history, it was mathematics. Every geometric pattern had meaning. The designs passed from grandmother to granddaughter, each generation adding their own variations while maintaining the core symbolism. A woman could look at another woman's moccasins and tell you what band she came from, probably what family, possibly even who taught her the patterns. Later, when glass beads arrived through trade, Lakota women adapted their ancient quillwork traditions to this new medium and created some of the most stunning beadwork ever produced by human hands. Intricate geometric patterns in dozens of colors, each bead placed individually with sinew thread and patience that makes my hands tired just thinking about it. These weren't hobbyists. These were master craftspeople working at the highest levels of their art. But let's get back to the warriors. Because this is the golden age of Lakota military power, and we need to understand what made them so formidable. The 7 bands, Oglala, Brule, Hunkpapa, Minneconjou, Sanzark, Blackfeet, and 2 Kettles, could field thousands of warriors. Not soldiers, warriors. There's a difference. Soldiers follow orders, fight as units, succeed through discipline and coordination. Warriors fought as individuals, earning personal honor, making split-second decisions based on years of training and cultural values that prized courage above survival. A Lakota warrior would ride into situations that would make professional soldiers refuse the order, not because they were crazy or suicidal, but because dying bravely was better than living cautiously. 2 names dominate this era in Lakota history, and they represent different paths to greatness. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, both born in the early 1800s, both shaped by this golden age, both destined to become legends. Crazy Horse, and that wasn't his original name, that was an earned name, a vision name, was born around 1840. Even as a boy, he was different. Quiet where others were boastful, thoughtful where others were impulsive, light-skinned and light-haired, which made him stand out among the Oglala. As a teenager, he started having visions. In one vision, he saw himself riding through battle with a stone behind his ear, a red lightning bolt painted on his cheek, and a hawk on his head. In this vision, bullets and arrows passed around him, but never hit him. His horse seemed to float above the ground. When he woke, he told his father, who was a holy man, and his father said, "This is your power. This is how you should prepare for battle." And Crazy Horse did. Before every fight, he performed specific rituals. The stone behind his ear, the lightning bolt, dust thrown over his horse. He rode into battle singing his personal song, and warriors who fought alongside him swore that he bore a charmed life. Bullets did seem to miss him. Arrows passed by without touching him. He fought in dozens of battles and received only 1 minor wound in his entire life. Was it magic? Was it psychology? The absolute confidence that made him ride differently, react faster, take risks that others wouldn't? Doesn't matter. His fellow warriors believed in his power, and belief is everything in war. When Crazy Horse rode into battle, men followed him into situations they might otherwise avoid because they thought his medicine protected everyone near him. Sitting Bull was different. Born around 1830, he earned his name, Tatanka Iyotake, which literally means buffalo bull who sits down, implying an animal so strong and stubborn it won't move, through both warrior prowess and spiritual power. By his 20s, he'd counted coup multiple times, taken enemy scalps, captured horses, and done all the things that made a man respected among the Lakota. But Sitting Bull had something more. He could see things others couldn't, not just far into the distance with good eyes, that was common among Plains people, but far into the future with vision. He would tell people it would rain in 3 days, and it would. He'd say enemy warriors were approaching from a certain direction, and they would appear. He claimed he could hear the thoughts of wolves and understand the language of birds. Some of this might have been careful observation and pattern recognition. Plains people spent their lives reading weather, tracking game, noticing subtle environmental changes. A man who paid attention could predict a lot, but some of it Some of it seemed to go beyond normal human capability, and the Lakota believed he had a direct line to Wakantanka, the great mystery, the sacred power that moves through all things. By 1850, Sitting Bull was both a distinguished warrior and a holy man, which was unusual. Most men specialized. You were either a warrior chief or a spiritual leader. Sitting Bull was both, and that made him uniquely powerful. He could lead men in battle and also interpret the signs and omens that guided crucial decisions. This was the era when a successful warrior might own 100 horses. Think about what that means economically. A good horse was worth 10 buffalo robes. A buffalo robe was worth maybe a week of intensive labor by a skilled woman. So 100 horses represented enormous accumulated wealth, thousands of hours of labor, dozens of successful raids, years of smart trading and gift-giving. But here's what's important. Wealth among the Lakota wasn't about hoarding. It was about giving. The most respected men were those who gave the most away. You held a feast and gave away horses to honor a son's first coup. You gave horses to families who'd lost members in war. You gave to the poor, the widowed, the orphaned. Generosity was the highest virtue, and a chief who accumulated wealth without sharing it would quickly find himself without followers. The buffalo herds during this period were almost incomprehensible in their size. Estimates suggest 30 to 60 million buffalo on the Great Plains in the early 1800s. Imagine that. Herds that stretched from horizon to horizon, taking days to pass a single point. The ground shaking from their weight. Clouds of dust visible for 50 miles. A single buffalo provided hundreds of pounds of meat. A hide for lodges or trade, sinew for thread and bowstrings, bones for tools, horns for ladles and cups, hooves for glue, organs for food, and even the tail for fly swatters. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be wasted when your survival depended on this animal. The Lakota developed hundreds of uses for buffalo, and in return, they developed rituals and prayers thanking the buffalo for giving themselves to the people. This relationship between the Lakota and the buffalo was spiritual, practical, and utterly central to everything they were. The buffalo wasn't just a resource, it was a relative, a gift from the sacred. And as long as the buffalo herds remained strong, the Lakota way of life could continue forever, or so it seemed. Because in 1850, the Lakota stood at their absolute peak. They controlled the best buffalo ranges on the northern plains. They defeated or driven off rival tribes. Their population was growing. Their warriors were respected and feared across the West. Young men like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull were coming of age, preparing to take their places in the great ongoing story of their people. The sky above was limitless. The grass below stretched forever. The buffalo herds darkened the plains. And nothing, absolutely nothing in Lakota experience suggested that this golden age would end. But the United States was pushing westward. Wagon trains were crossing Lakota territory with increasing frequency. Gold seekers were eyeing the Black Hills, the sacred heart of Lakota country. And the collision between these two peoples, one at the height of their power, one just beginning to understand what industrial warfare could accomplish, was now inevitable. That collision would produce moments of triumph and tragedy, battles that would be studied for generations, leaders who would become legends on both sides. And ultimately, it would answer a question that neither side probably wanted to ask. What happens when courage and skill and honor meet artillery and railroads and manifest destiny? We're about to find out. Now think about what a horse meant to a plains people. On foot, a hunter might track a buffalo herd for days, get one shot with a bow or lance, then watch the herd thunder away while he spent hours butchering his kill. On horseback, everything changed. You could keep pace with the buffalo, strike from different angles, bring down multiple animals in a single hunt. A successful hunter could feed not just his family, but his entire band. But it was more than practical. Young Lakota men took to horses with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Boys as young as 5 or 6 were riding. By their teens, they could perform feats of horsemanship that astonished white observers who saw them later. hanging off the side of a galloping horse protected by its body, firing arrows under its neck, changing mounts at full gallop during battle or hunt, controlling their horses with subtle shifts of weight while both hands worked bow or lance, the warrior standing buffalo, and yes, that was his actual name, was among the first Lakota to truly master mounted combat. The stories say he could ride for days without dismounting, sleeping in the saddle while his horse walked. He could shoot 20 arrows in the time it took a musket-armed warrior to fire and reload once. And he understood something crucial. Horses weren't just tools. They were partners. You didn't just ride a good war horse. You bonded with it, trained with it, trusted it with your life. That first generation of mounted Lakota warriors must have felt like they'd acquired superpowers. And in a sense, they had. They could cover distances in hours that used to take days. They could carry more supplies, move entire villages faster, strike enemies who thought they were safely distant. The acquisition of horses didn't just change Lakota tactics, it changed their entire society. Young men could now accumulate wealth in a way that was never possible before. A successful warrior might own 50 horses. A great warrior? 100 or more. Horses became currency. You traded horses for goods. You gave horses as gifts to seal alliances or honor achievements. You paid bride price in horses. A good woman from a respected family might be worth 10 or 20 horses. A testament to the value placed on both women and horses in Lakota society. And the buffalo hunts. We need to talk about those buffalo hunts. Imagine you're a young warrior, maybe 18 or 19 years old. It's early summer, and scouts have located a herd maybe 5,000 strong. The hunt chief organizes the approach. Silence is critical. Buffalo can smell humans from miles away on the prairie wind. You're mounted on your best hunting horse, the one you've trained for 2 years. You carry a short, powerful bow and a quiver of arrows marked with your personal design. Your lance, if you're brave or crazy enough to use one, is 7 feet of ashwood tipped with an iron point you got by trading 3 buffalo robes to a white trader. The signal comes. Suddenly you're galloping, and I mean full gallop, toward a mass of massive beasts that can weigh 2,000 pounds each. The thunder of hooves, yours and theirs, drowns out everything else. Dust clouds rise 50 feet in the air. Other hunters are to your left and right, everyone trying to position themselves alongside the stampeding animals. Your horse knows its job. It guides you close to a buffalo, so close your leg almost brushes the beast's shaggy coat. You pick your target, a cow, not a bull, because the meat's better and she's slightly smaller. You draw your bow, aiming for the spot just behind the front. Leg where the arrow can reach the heart, or lungs, release, draw again, release. A good hunter could put 3 arrows into a buffalo in the time it took the animal to take 6 running strides. Your arrow finds its mark. The buffalo staggers, blood foaming from its nostrils. It will die soon, but you're already moving to the next target. The whole hunt might last 15 or 20 minutes. When it's over, there are 50 or 60 dead buffaloes scattered across a mile of prairie, and your heart is pounding so hard you can hear it in your ears over the ringing silence. This is what horses gave the Lakota, not just mobility, transformation. They began calling themselves Lakota, allies, to distinguish themselves from their Dakota relatives who remained in the woodlands. They developed warrior societies. The Kit Fox, the Strong Hearts, the Crow Owners, each with its own songs, regalia, and codes of honor. These weren't just military units. They were brotherhoods that provided structure, purpose, and identity to young men. The Kit Fox warriors, for instance, wore distinctive sashes that they would stake to the ground during battle. Once staked, a Kit Fox warrior could not retreat. He stayed in that spot, fighting until victory or death, unless another Kit Fox came and physically pulled up the stake. That's commitment. That's an honor system based not on legal contracts or written rules, but on shame, pride, and brotherhood. Young warriors competed for honors, counting coup, capturing horses, protecting the people. A man who touched an enemy in battle without killing him earned more honor than one who killed from a distance. Why? Because it required more courage. It proved you could close with the enemy, risk everything, and survive. 3 or 4 coups might make you respected. 10 made you famous. 20 or more, you were a legend. But here's what often gets missed in the romantic narratives about Lakota warriors. This wasn't mindless aggression. This was a sophisticated military culture with strategy, discipline, and purpose. War leaders like Red Cloud's father earned their positions through proven ability, not inheritance. They planned campaigns, organized logistics, and made decisions that affected hundreds of lives. They understood terrain, weather, enemy capabilities, and the psychology of warfare. Between 1750 and 1800, the Lakota pushed steadily westward and southward, challenging the tribes that held the best buffalo ranges. They fought the Crow for the Powder River country. They battled the Kiowa and Pawnee on the southern plains. And they won. Not every battle, not without setbacks and losses, but over time, they won. By the early 1800s, the Lakota controlled territory from the Missouri River to the Bighorn Mountains, from the Platte River north into present-day Canada. This expansion happened because the Lakota combined superior horsemanship with tactical flexibility and, crucially, numbers. Those 7 council fires that left the woodlands, their population was growing. Success in buffalo hunting meant better nutrition. Better nutrition meant healthier children. More children meant more warriors. More warriors meant they could field larger war parties than their enemies. But it wasn't just military conquest. The Lakota were also traders, diplomats, and absorbers of new people. They allied with the Cheyenne and Arapaho. They traded with the Mandan and Hidatsa. They incorporated individuals and even whole families from other tribes who married in or chose to join them. The Lakota identity wasn't purely about bloodline. It was about adopting the language, customs, and values of the people. By the mid-1800s, the Lakota numbered somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people divided into 7 bands. The Oglala, Brûlé, Hunkpapa, Minneconjou, Sans-Arc, Blackfeet, and Two Kettles. Each band had its own territory and leadership, but they came together for ceremonies, councils, and major buffalo hunts. They called themselves the Lakota Nation, and they had every reason to believe their power would last forever. Because from their perspective in, say, 1850, the future looked bright. The buffalo herds still darkened the plains. Their warriors were feared and respected across the West. They'd successfully adapted to plains life in just over a century, transforming themselves from woodland villagers to mounted nomads who could appear anywhere, strike hard, and vanish like smoke on the prairie wind. Young men like the one who would become known as Crazy Horse were growing up in this golden age. Boys learning to ride before they could walk properly. Learning to shoot arrows with deadly accuracy by age 8 or 9. Listening to warriors tell stories of great battles and successful raids. Dreaming of the day they'd earn their own honors, their own names, their own places in the warrior societies. They had no way of knowing that this world, this perfect adaptation to the plains, this pinnacle of horse culture, this moment of supreme confidence, was about to collide with another people moving west with equal determination. People who brought not just horses but machines, not just warriors but armies, not just the desire for land but the conviction that they had the right, the duty, even the divine mandate to take it. But that collision was coming, and when it came, it would produce some of the most dramatic and tragic chapters in American history. Battles that would become legends, leaders whose names would echo across centuries, and ultimately a reckoning that would test whether courage and skill and honor could stand against industrial warfare and manifest destiny. That story, the story of what happened when the Lakota Nation met the United States of America at the height of both their powers. That's where we're heading. Next, there's a moment in history, brief, shining, probably impossible to sustain, but magnificent while it lasted, when the Lakota stood at the absolute pinnacle of their power. Between 1750 and 1850, roughly a century, they controlled an empire of grass that stretched from the Missouri River to the Bighorn Mountains. And when I say empire, I mean it. They dominated the northern Great Plains, the way Rome dominated the Mediterranean. through military prowess, strategic alliances, and an economic system built on the most valuable resource in their world, buffalo. Let's talk about what summer meant to the Lakota during this golden age. By June, the scattered bands that had wintered separately in protected river valleys would begin converging on predetermined gathering sites. Imagine watching this happen. First, a few dozen lodges appear on the prairie, then a few dozen more, then hundreds. Within days, a temporary city of 3,000 or 4,000 people materializes where there was nothing but grass and wind. These weren't random camps. They were circles, the sacred hoop, with openings facing east to greet the rising sun. Family lodges clustered together. The council lodge stood at the center, and everywhere you looked there were horses. Thousands of horses grazing on the surrounding prairie, guarded by young boys who took their responsibility seriously because losing horses to enemy raiders brought shame on the whole family. The camps buzzed with activity. Women worked tanning buffalo hides using a process that took days of labor, scraping, stretching, working the hide with a mixture of buffalo brains and fat until it became supple leather. And yes, you heard that right, buffalo brains. They contain oils that, when worked into the hide, create leather so soft you could mistake it for fabric. A skilled woman could produce a hide worth 2 horses in trade. That's real wealth. That's economic power. Meanwhile, the men prepared for the sun dance. Now this is where we need to be careful, because the sun dance has been romanticized and misunderstood probably more than any other Native American ceremony. It wasn't savage. It wasn't mindless. It was one of the most profound religious experiences in human culture, and it required preparation, discipline, and a kind of courage that most of us can't imagine. The sun dance lasted 4 days, sometimes longer. Participants fasted, no food, no water, under the brutal Dakota summer sun. They danced continuously, staring at the sun until their vision blurred and the world started to break apart around them. And some warriors, the bravest or most desperate, chose to pierce. Here's how that worked. A holy man, using a bone awl or sharp knife, would cut 2 slits in the warrior's chest muscles. Through each slit, he'd insert a wooden skewer made from eagle bone. And eagles were sacred, so this wasn't just any stick. Rawhide ropes connected the skewers to the sacred tree at the center of the dance circle. Then the warrior would lean back, putting his full weight on the ropes, and dance. Dance while the skewers pulled against his flesh. Dance while blood ran down his chest. Dance sometimes for hours until the flesh finally tore free. Why? Why would anyone do this? Because they were praying, making an offering of the only thing that was truly theirs, their own flesh, their own pain. They were seeking visions, asking for guidance, praying for the people. Warriors pierced before going to war, asking for protection. Fathers pierced when children were sick, offering their pain in exchange for healing. This wasn't barbarism. This was devotion. Red Cloud's father, we don't know his name, which is frustrating, but we know he was an Oglala war leader of some reputation, pierced multiple times during his life. One account says he danced until he collapsed from blood loss and dehydration, and in his vision he saw himself leading warriors to victory against the Pawnee. 3 weeks later, he did exactly that, bringing home 50 captured horses and establishing his reputation. Coincidence? Maybe. But try telling that to someone who just danced with eagle bones through their chest for the better part of a day. The Sundance served another purpose beyond the spiritual. It unified the bands. For those few weeks in summer, the Oglala and Brule and Hunkpapa weren't separate groups. They were one people, sharing ceremonies, arranging marriages, settling disputes, and planning the year's major buffalo hunts and military campaigns. The Council of Chiefs and Elders made decisions that affected the entire nation. Young warriors from different bands competed in games and races, building relationships that would last lifetimes. And the women, we need to talk about the women, because they're often invisible in the warrior-focused narratives, and that's a massive oversight. Lakota women owned the lodges. They owned the household goods. When a couple divorced, which was common and carried no particular stigma, The man left with basically his weapons and his horse, and the woman kept everything else. The lodge, the food stores, the tools, the children. Women controlled wealth in ways that would surprise most Americans at the time. A woman known for her quill work or beadwork could accumulate significant resources. She could own dozens of horses. She could have multiple lodges. She could be consulted by chiefs on matters of diplomacy and war because intelligence and wisdom weren't considered male traits in Lakota culture. They were human traits. The quill work these women produced wasn't just decorative. It was art. It was history. It was mathematics. Every geometric pattern had meaning. The designs passed from grandmother to granddaughter, each generation adding their own variations while maintaining the core symbolism. A woman could look at another woman's moccasins and tell you what band she came from, probably what family, possibly even who taught her the patterns. Later, when glass beads arrived through trade, Lakota women adapted their ancient quillwork traditions to this new medium and created some of the most stunning beadwork ever produced by human hands. Intricate geometric patterns in dozens of colors, each bead placed individually with sinew thread and patience that makes my hands tired just thinking about it. These weren't hobbyists. These were master craftspeople working at the highest levels of their art. But let's get back to the warriors, because this is the golden age of Lakota military power, and we need to understand what made them so formidable. The 7 bands, Oglala, Brule, Hunkpapa, Minneconjou, Sanzark, Blackfeet, and 2 Kettles, could field thousands of warriors. Not soldiers, warriors. There's a difference. Soldiers follow orders, fight as units, succeed through discipline and coordination. Warriors fought as individuals, earning personal honor, making split-second decisions based on years of training and cultural values that prized courage above survival. A Lakota warrior would ride into situations that would make professional soldiers refuse the order. Not because they were crazy or suicidal, but because dying bravely was better than living cautiously. 2 names dominate this era in Lakota history, and they represent different paths to greatness. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, both born in the early 1800s, both shaped by this golden age, both destined to become legends. Crazy Horse, and that wasn't his original name, that was an earned name, a vision name, was born around 1840. Even as a boy, he was different. Quiet where others were boastful, thoughtful where others were impulsive, light-skinned and light-haired, which made him stand out among the Oglala. As a teenager, he started having visions. In one vision, he saw himself riding through battle with a stone behind his ear, a red lightning bolt painted on his cheek, and a hawk on his head. In this vision, bullets and arrows passed around him but never hit him. His horse seemed to float above the ground. When he woke, he told his father, who was a holy man, and his father said, "This is your power. This is how you should prepare for battle." And Crazy Horse did. Before every fight, he performed specific rituals. The stone behind his ear, the lightning bolt, dust thrown over his horse. He rode into battle singing his personal song, and warriors who fought alongside him swore that he bore a charmed life. Bullets did seem to miss him. Arrows passed by without touching him. He fought in dozens of battles and received only one minor wound in his entire life. Was it magic? Was it psychology? The absolute confidence that made him ride differently, react faster, take risks that others wouldn't? Doesn't matter. His fellow warriors believed in his power, and belief is everything in war. When Crazy Horse rode into battle, men followed him into situations they might otherwise avoid because they thought his medicine protected everyone near him. Sitting Bull was different. Born around 1830, he earned his name, Tatanka Iyotake, which literally means buffalo bull who sits down, implying an animal so strong and stubborn it won't move, through both warrior prowess and spiritual power. By his 20s, he'd counted coup multiple times, taken enemy scalps, captured horses, and done all the things that made a man respected among the Lakota. But Sitting Bull had something more. He could see things others couldn't, not just far into the distance with good eyes, that was common among plains people, but far into the future with vision. He would tell people it would rain in 3 days, and it would. He'd say enemy warriors were approaching from a certain direction, and they would appear. He claimed he could hear the thoughts of wolves and understand the language of birds. Some of this might have been careful observation and pattern recognition. Plains people spent their lives reading weather, tracking game, noticing subtle environmental changes. A man who paid attention could predict a lot. But some of it seemed to go beyond normal human capability. And the Lakota believed he had a direct line to Wakantanka, the great mystery, the sacred power that moves through all things. By 1850, Sitting Bull was both a distinguished warrior and a holy man, which was unusual. Most men specialized. You were either a warrior chief or a spiritual leader. Sitting Bull was both, and that made him uniquely powerful. He could lead men in battle and also interpret the signs and omens that guided crucial decisions. This was the era when a successful warrior might own 100 horses. Think about what that means economically. A good horse was worth 10 buffalo robes. A buffalo robe was worth maybe a week of intensive labor by a skilled woman. So 100 horses represented enormous accumulated wealth. Thousands of hours of labor, dozens of successful raids, years of smart trading and gift-giving. But here's what's important. Wealth among the Lakota wasn't about hoarding. It was about giving. The most respected men were those who gave the most away. You held a feast and gave away horses to honor a son's first coup. You gave horses to families who'd lost members in war. You gave to the poor, the widowed, the orphaned. Generosity was the highest virtue, and a chief who accumulated wealth without sharing it would quickly find himself without followers. The buffalo herds during this period were almost incomprehensible in their size. Estimates suggest 30 to 60 million buffalo on the Great Plains in the early 1800s. Imagine that. Herds that stretched from horizon to horizon, taking days to pass a single point. The ground shaking from their weight. Clouds of dust visible for 50 miles. A single buffalo provided hundreds of pounds of meat. A hide for lodges or trade, sinew for thread and bowstrings, bones for tools, horns for ladles and cups, hooves for glue, organs for food, and even the tail for fly swatters. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be wasted when your survival depended on this animal. The Lakota developed hundreds of uses for buffalo, and in return, they developed rituals and prayers, thanking the buffalo for giving themselves to the people. This relationship between the Lakota and the buffalo was spiritual, practical, and utterly central to everything they were. The buffalo wasn't just a resource, it was a relative, a gift from the sacred. And as long as the buffalo herds remained strong, the Lakota way of life could continue forever, or so it seemed. Because in 1850, the Lakota stood at their absolute peak. They controlled the best buffalo ranges on the northern plains. They defeated or driven off rival tribes. Their population was growing. Their warriors were respected and feared across the West. Young men like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull were coming of age, preparing to take their places in the great ongoing story of their people. The sky above was limitless. The grass below stretched forever. The buffalo herds darkened the plains. And nothing, absolutely nothing in Lakota experience suggested that this golden age would end. But the United States was pushing westward. Wagon trains were crossing Lakota territory with increasing frequency. Gold seekers were eyeing the Black Hills, the sacred heart of Lakota country. And the collision between these two peoples, one at the height of their power, one just beginning to understand what industrial warfare could accomplish, was now inevitable. That collision would produce moments of triumph and tragedy, battles that would be studied for generations, leaders who would become legends on both sides. And ultimately, it would answer a question that neither side probably wanted to ask. What happens when courage and skill and honor meet artillery and railroads and manifest destiny? We're about to find out. August 29th, 1854. Remember that date, because it's when everything changed. Not gradually, not through a series of escalating tensions that gave people time to adjust. Instantly, in the span of about 5 minutes, the relationship between the Lakota and the United States went from uneasy coexistence to open warfare. And it happened over something so trivial, it's almost laughable. Except nothing about what followed was funny. Here's what happened. A Mormon emigrant wagon was passing through Lakota territory near Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming. The emigrants had a cow, a Dakota warrior. Accounts say he was Minneconjou, visiting relatives in the Brule camp, saw the cow wandering away from the wagon train and killed it. Maybe he thought it was abandoned. Maybe he was hungry. Maybe he just didn't think it mattered, because in Lakota culture, killing a stray animal wasn't theft. It was common sense. The emigrants complained to the army at Fort Laramie. They wanted justice. They wanted compensation. They wanted the warrior arrested. And the army, in its wisdom, sent Second Lieutenant John Grattan to handle the situation. Now, John Grattan was 23 years old, fresh from West Point, full of confidence and theories about warfare that he'd learned from books and lectures. He'd been stationed at Fort Laramie for less than a year and had exactly zero experience dealing with Plains Indians. But he had opinions. Oh, he had opinions. He told people that with a handful of good soldiers, he could handle any Indian problem. That the Lakota were cowards who would run at the first show of force. On August 19th, Grattan rode out to the Brule camp with 29 soldiers, 2 howitzers, and an interpreter who was so drunk he could barely sit his horse. The warrior who'd killed the cow was in the lodge of Conquering Bear, a respected chief who'd signed the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. Conquering Bear tried to negotiate. He offered horses as compensation, significantly more than the cow was worth. He explained that he didn't have authority to simply hand over the warrior, who wasn't even from his band. Grattan refused. He wanted the warrior immediately, or he'd take him by force. Conquering Bear kept trying to find a middle ground. The drunk interpreter was shouting insults, translating Grattan's demands in the most offensive possible terms. Warriors were gathering, watching this young officer threaten their chief in his own camp. Tensions rose. Heads moved toward weapons, and then Grattan gave the order to fire. The howitzers roared. The volley struck Conquering Bear, mortally wounding him. For maybe 2 seconds, there was shocked silence. Then the warriors attacked. Within minutes, and I mean minutes, not hours, every single soldier was dead. All 29 of them, plus the interpreter. Their bodies bristled with so many arrows that one witness said they looked like porcupines. The Grattan Massacre, white people called it. The Grattan Fight, the Lakota called it. But whatever name you use, the result was the same. The United States Army had suffered a humiliating defeat. Soldiers sent to arrest one man over a cow had all died in a one-sided battle that lasted less time than it takes to boil water. And the army could not let that stand. General William Harney took command of the response. Now here's something you need to understand about Harney. He was known as the Butcher for a reason. He'd made his reputation fighting Seminoles in Florida, where he distinguished himself by being absolutely ruthless in pursuing not just warriors, but entire communities. When Harney was given a problem, he solved it with overwhelming violence. On September 3, 1855, Harney found a Brule camp at Ash Hollow in present-day Nebraska. It was a peaceful camp, under a chief named Little Thunder. They had no connection to the warriors who'd killed Grattan. Harney didn't care. He attacked at dawn with 600 soldiers and cavalry. The Brule fought back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Warriors tried to hold positions, while women and children fled up the ravines. Soldiers pursued them, into the ravines, up the slopes. Soldiers shot fleeing women, shot children, shot old people who couldn't run. When the smoke cleared, 86 Lakota were dead. 70 more, mostly women and children, were captured. The message was clear. Kill one soldier, we kill 100 of your people. Attack the army, we attack your families. This wasn't warfare between warriors following codes of honor. This was something new, something industrial, something that treated civilians as legitimate targets to punish the entire tribe. For the next several years, tensions simmered. Wagon trains continued crossing Lakota land. Settlers continued pushing west. And the Lakota continued their traditional way of life, hunting buffalo, raiding enemies, gathering for ceremonies. But everyone knew the situation couldn't last. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 had promised that Lakota territory would remain Lakota territory in perpetuity. But what did that mean when wagon trains cut permanent trails across the prairie? When forts appeared along those trails? When each year brought more emigrants who saw the plains as empty land waiting to be claimed? Then came 1863 and the discovery of gold in Montana. Suddenly, thousands of miners needed to get to Montana territory fast. The safest, shortest route went through the Powder River country, the absolute heart of Lakota territory, the best buffalo hunting grounds, the sacred land that the Oglala and other bands had fought to control for decades. The army decided to build forts along this route, called the Bozeman Trail. Not temporary camps, permanent forts. Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, Fort C.F. Smith. They were announcing their intention to occupy Lakota land indefinitely to protect emigrants and miners passing through, whether the Lakota agreed or not, and the Lakota did not agree. Red Cloud, an Oglala chief who'd been building his reputation for years, called the northern bands together. This was an existential threat. Allow the Bozeman Trail to operate, and the buffalo herds would be disrupted. The sacred land would be violated. White settlement would follow the forts as surely as rain follows clouds. They had to fight. They had to close the trail. They had no other choice. Red Cloud understood something crucial about this fight. The forts themselves didn't matter. They could surround the forts, besiege them, make life miserable for the garrisons, but fortifications are hard to assault successfully. What mattered were the supply columns, the wood-cutting parties, the mounted patrols. Any time soldiers left the safety of their walls, they were vulnerable. Make those trips dangerous enough, costly enough in lives and resources, and the army would eventually decide the Bozeman Trail wasn't worth defending. It was a strategy of attrition, a strategy of patience, and it required discipline, coordination, and brilliant tactical execution. Red Cloud had all three. Throughout 1866, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors harassed Fort Phil Kearny constantly. Soldiers couldn't cut wood without armed escorts. Supply wagons needed heavy guards. Patrols rode out knowing they might not come back. The fort commander, Colonel Henry Carrington, understood the danger. He gave strict orders: do not pursue warriors beyond sight of the fort. Do not be drawn into ambushes. Stay defensive. Carrington wasn't a coward. He was a realist who understood that Red Cloud was trying to bait them into tactical mistakes. But Captain William Fetterman thought he knew better. Fetterman had fought in the Civil War. He'd seen real battles with thousands of men firing rifles and artillery across open fields. These small-scale skirmishes with Indians seemed trivial by comparison. He told people that with 80 good men, he could ride through the entire Sioux nation. December 21st, 1866. A wood-cutting party came under attack near Fort Phil Kearny. Carrington sent Fetterman with 80 soldiers, infantry and cavalry, to relieve them. His orders were explicit: relieve the wood train, but do not pursue warriors beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. Do not chase anyone out of sight of the fort. Fetterman acknowledged the orders. He rode out with his 80 men, and when a small party of Lakota warriors appeared, apparently trying to attack the wood train, Fetterman pursued them. The warriors retreated, just slowly enough to keep the soldiers following, led by a young warrior named Crazy Horse, among others. Up toward Lodge Trail Ridge, just a few more minutes and we can catch them. Just a little farther. Fetterman crossed Lodge Trail Ridge, moving out of sight of the fort, and 2,000 warriors who'd been waiting in the ravines and behind the hills closed the trap. Oglala, Minneconjou, Cheyenne, Arapaho. Led by Red Cloud's careful planning, they swarmed over Fetterman's command like a wave. The fight lasted maybe 40 minutes. Some soldiers tried to form defensive positions. Others tried to run. It didn't matter. They were surrounded, outnumbered 20 to 1, miles from help. Warriors came at them from every direction. The bow and arrow was actually superior to the single-shot rifle in this kind of close combat. A skilled warrior could fire 10 or 12 arrows while a soldier reloaded once. When relief forces finally reached the site, they found 81 dead soldiers. Fetterman had 80, plus a civilian who'd insisted on coming along. Every single one. Not one soldier survived. Some bodies had been mutilated, which horrified white audiences when the story spread. But that mutilation followed specific cultural patterns, taking trophies, ensuring enemies couldn't harm you in the afterlife, sending messages about what happens to invaders of sacred land. The Fetterman fight, or the Battle of the 100 Slain, as the Army called it, was the worst defeat suffered by the U.S. Army in the Indian Wars until the Little Bighorn 10 years later. And here's what's important: it worked. Red Cloud's strategy worked. The Bozeman Trail became so dangerous that the Army couldn't maintain it. Forts that required constant resupply through hostile territory became untenable. Civilians stopped trying to use the trail. In 1868, the United States signed the Fort Laramie Treaty with Red Cloud and other Lakota leaders. The Bozeman Trail would be abandoned. The forts would be dismantled. The Powder River country would remain Lakota territory. The Black Hills would be inviolate, no whites allowed without permission. Red Cloud had won. He'd defeated the United States in what amounted to a guerrilla war of attrition. It was the only time in American history that the government signed a treaty with Native Americans after losing a war. Every other treaty was signed by defeated tribes, forced to accept whatever terms were offered. But Red Cloud forced the U.S. to negotiate from a position of weakness. Warriors watched Fort Phil Kearny burn as the Army withdrew. They'd defended their land. They'd protected the buffalo herds. They'd proven that courage and tactical brilliance could defeat superior technology. But even as Red Cloud celebrated this victory, even as the forts burned and soldiers retreated, something else was happening far to the south. A new kind of military force was forming. Generals who'd learned lessons from the Civil War about total warfare. Politicians who decided that the Indian problem needed a permanent solution. And thousands of settlers who saw the plains as their future home, regardless of what any treaty said. And in 1874, a cavalry column led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer rode into the Black Hills, the sacred Paha Sapa, the heart of Lakota spirituality, the land guaranteed to them by treaty, and discovered gold. Custer announced the discovery to the newspapers. Within months, thousands of miners were flooding into the Black Hills, breaking the treaty, violating sacred ground, and setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to one of the most famous battles in American history. Red Cloud had won the battle for the Bozeman Trail, but the war was just beginning, and this time the United States wasn't going to negotiate. This time they were going to bring overwhelming force. This time, they were going to solve the problem permanently. The collision between two worlds, between two ways of life, was about to reach its terrible climax. And warriors like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, who'd come of age during the golden years, who'd never known defeat, who believed in their medicine and their courage and their rightness, they were about to face the full industrial might of the United States military. What happened next would become legend. But legends are built on blood and sacrifice and the clash of incompatible visions of the future. And that's exactly what was coming to the Northern Plains in the summer of 1876, June 1876. The Rosebud River in Montana Territory. Sitting Bull stood before the sacred pole with a knife in his hand and absolute determination in his eyes. He'd already been dancing for hours under the brutal sun. No food, no water. His lips cracked and bleeding, his body swaying with exhaustion. And now he was going to make an offering that would change history. His adopted brother held his arms steady. Sitting Bull placed the knife against his skin, just below the shoulder, and cut. A small piece of flesh, maybe the size of a grain of rice. He didn't flinch, didn't cry out. Just methodical, controlled cuts moving down his arm. 1 piece, 2 pieces, 10 pieces, 20 pieces. He switched arms, kept cutting. The blood ran down his arms, dripped onto the ground, darkened the earth where he danced. 50 pieces of flesh. 100. He later said he lost count somewhere after that. But witnesses said by the time he finished, he'd offered approximately 100 pieces of his own body to Wakantanka, praying for guidance, for protection, for vision. Then he danced, bled and danced under the sun, until consciousness slipped away and the vision came. He saw soldiers falling from the sky, upside down, like grasshoppers with their heads cut off, falling into the Lakota camp. And he heard a voice saying, "I give you these because they have no ears," meaning the soldiers wouldn't listen, wouldn't negotiate, wouldn't respect the Lakota. They would come, and they would die. Sitting Bull woke and told the people about his vision. Soldiers were coming, many soldiers, but they would be defeated. The people believed him because Sitting Bull's visions had proven accurate before, and because by June of 1876, war was inevitable anyway. The question wasn't if the army would attack, but when and where. Here's the situation. After Custer's expedition found gold in the Black Hills in 1874, miners flooded in by the thousands. The army made a token effort to keep them out, but let's be honest, they didn't try very hard. The government offered to buy the Black Hills. Red Cloud and other treaty chiefs considered it, but warriors like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull refused. The Paho Sapa weren't for sale at any price. They were sacred. They were the heart of Lakota territory. Selling them would be like selling the sun or the wind. When the Lakota refused to sell, the government manufactured a crisis. They declared that all Lakota must report to reservation agencies by January 31st, 1876, or be considered hostile. In the middle of winter, when the bands were scattered in winter camps across hundreds of miles of territory, when travel was nearly impossible through snow and ice, it was a deadline designed to be missed. Most bands ignored it, not out of defiance necessarily, but because moving entire villages in January through Montana and Dakota territory simply wasn't feasible. So when January 31st passed, the government declared them hostile. And that meant the army could hunt them down wherever they found them. General Philip Sheridan, the man who'd said the only good Indian was a dead Indian, though he later claimed that was a misquote, organized a three-pronged campaign. General George Crook from the south, Colonel John Gibbon from the west, and General Alfred Terry from the east, with Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer commanding the 7th Cavalry under Terry's overall command. The plan was simple: trap the hostiles between converging columns and force a decisive battle. What the army didn't fully grasp was the scale of what they were up against. In the spring of 1876, thousands of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho were gathering along the Rosebud and Little Bighorn rivers. Not for war initially, but for the annual summer gathering. The Sundance, buffalo hunting, trading, socializing. But as word spread about the army's intentions, more bands came in. Not to surrender, to resist. Warriors who'd been living on reservations slipped away to join the free bands. Young men eager for glory, old warriors wanting one more fight. By June, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 Native Americans were gathered in the largest concentration of Plains Indians anyone had ever seen. And of those, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 were warriors. Crook moved first. He pushed north with over 1,000 soldiers and hundreds of Crow and Shoshone scouts, tribal enemies of the Lakota who saw this as a chance to settle old scores. On June 17th, on the Rosebud River, Crazy Horse led a force of perhaps 1,000 warriors in a direct assault on Crook's column. This wasn't a typical Plains Indian battle with hit-and-run tactics. This was sustained, aggressive fighting. Warriors charged repeatedly over several hours, trying to break Crook's lines. The Battle of the Rosebud ended with both sides claiming victory. Crook held the field, but he took casualties and decided to fall back to resupply. The Lakota and Cheyenne withdrew in good order. But here's what mattered: Crook was out of the fight. He wouldn't participate in the campaign's next phase. The three-pronged trap now had only 2 prongs. After the Rosebud, the camp moved to the Little Bighorn River, the Greasy Grass, the Lakota called it. By June 25th, it stretched for maybe 3 miles along the river valley. Thousands of lodges. Circles within circles, Oglala, Hunkpapa, Minneconjou, Cheyenne, Sans Arc, Blackfeet. This wasn't just a camp. It was a temporary city, the largest gathering of Plains Indians in modern memory. And George Armstrong Custer was riding toward it with about 650 soldiers of the 7th Cavalry. Now we need to talk about Custer, because he's become a mythological figure, and mythology obscures understanding. Custer was 36 years old. He'd been a genuine hero in the Civil War, the youngest general in the Union Army, known for aggressive cavalry charges and personal bravery. After the war, he'd reverted to lieutenant colonel, but kept the honorary title general that everyone used. He'd fought Indians before, most notoriously attacking Black Kettle's peaceful Cheyenne village on the Washita River in 1868. Killing over 100 people, including women and children, Custer was ambitious. He wanted glory. He wanted headlines. He was probably thinking about politics after his military career. A decisive victory over the Lakota could make him a national hero. So when his scouts located the massive village on the Little Bighorn, Custer made a critical decision. He wouldn't wait for Terry and Gibbon to arrive. He wouldn't gather intelligence about the camp's size. He would attack immediately, before the Indians could scatter. At noon on June 25th, Custer divided his command into 3 battalions. Major Marcus Reno, with about 140 men, would attack the south end of the village. Captain Frederick Benteen, with about 125 men, would sweep to the left, cutting off escape routes. Custer himself would take about 210 men and attack from another angle. The pack train with ammunition and supplies would follow behind. Dividing your force in the face of an enemy of unknown strength is, let's call it, problematic. But Custer's experience suggested that Indians would flee when attacked by soldiers. His problem was usually pursuing them before they could escape, not fighting them in pitched battle. He assumed the Lakota would run. He assumed wrong. Reno attacked first, splashing across the Little Bighorn River and charging toward the south end of the camp around 3 in the afternoon. And the village didn't panic, didn't flee. Warriors poured out of lodges, grabbing weapons, catching horses. Gall, a Hunkpapa war chief, rallied defenders. Crazy Horse prepared to lead a counterattack. Women and children ran north toward safety, but warriors stayed to fight. Reno's charge faltered almost immediately. Warriors swarmed around his flanks. His Indian scouts fled. Soldiers dismounted and tried to form a skirmish line in some timber near the river, but the defensive position quickly became untenable. Warriors infiltrated through the trees. Arrows came from unexpected angles. Soldiers started dying. Reno ordered a retreat back across the river, and here's where discipline broke down completely. The retreat became a rout. Men scrambled for their horses. Abandoned wounded comrades raced for the river while warriors pursued, shooting them from their saddles. Reno's battalion made it to a bluff across the river and dug in, but they'd lost about 40 men in maybe 30 minutes of fighting, and they were effectively out of the battle. Benteen, meanwhile, had found nothing on his sweep to the left. He returned to find Reno's shattered battalion on the bluff. They combined forces and fortified their position. Benteen wanted to go find Custer. Reno refused to move, so about 300 soldiers sat on a hill while the battle's decisive phase happened a few miles away, and they could hear it. The gunfire, the war cries, the sound of hundreds of warriors singing their death songs. Custer's battalion had moved north along the bluffs east of the river, apparently intending to attack the village from a different direction. We don't know exactly what he was thinking because no soldier with Custer survived to tell the story. Everything we know comes from Native American accounts and archaeological evidence. What we know is that Custer reached a high point, now called Custer Hill, overlooking the village. What we know is that warriors including Crazy Horse, Gall, Crow King, and hundreds of others crossed the river and moved up the ravines toward Custer's position. What we know is that within an hour, every single soldier with Custer was dead. The details come from Native American witnesses. Wooden leg, a northern Cheyenne warrior, described how soldiers tried to hold positions but couldn't maintain fire discipline. Their Springfield carbines overheated and jammed. Meanwhile, warriors had newer Winchester repeating rifles. Ironically, many captured from previous battles or bought from traders. Warriors could fire, take cover, fire again, while soldiers struggled with their single-shot weapons. Two Moon, another Cheyenne warrior, said the soldiers shot well at first, but seemed to lose cohesion quickly. They broke into smaller groups. Some tried to reach ravines for cover. Some shot their horses to create barricades. Some ran. All died. Gall led warriors up the ravines from the north. Crazy Horse swept around from the south and west. Crow King pressed from the river. Custer's men were surrounded, taking fire from all sides. The dust was so thick you couldn't see 50 feet. The noise was overwhelming. Gunfire, war cries, horses screaming, men shouting. Black Elk, only 13 years old, followed the warriors into the fight. He later described seeing soldiers lying dead on the hillside, some with arrows, some with bullet wounds, some with wounds from war clubs and lances. He took his first scalp that day, though he said later that the image haunted him for years. Buffalo Calf Road woman, a Cheyenne, fought alongside the men. She knocked a soldier from his horse, counting coup and taking his weapons. She wasn't the only woman who fought. Several accounts mention women joining the battle, especially after the fighting around Reno's position made clear that soldiers would shoot women and children as readily as warriors. The battle lasted less than an hour from start to finish, maybe 45 minutes. The time it takes the sun to move the width of a lodgepole across the sky, as one account described it. When the smoke cleared and the dust settled, 265 soldiers and attached personnel lay dead on a stretch of ridge and hillside, maybe half a mile long, including George Armstrong Custer, shot through the chest and head. His body wasn't mutilated much. Some accounts say warriors recognized him and respected him as a worthy enemy. Others say Cheyenne women who'd lost family at the Washita wanted to cut him up but were stopped by other warriors. The Lakota and Cheyenne called it the Battle of the Greasy Grass. White Americans called it Custer's last stand. Though stand might not be the right word for what happened. It was annihilation, the worst defeat suffered by the U.S. Army in the Indian Wars. A complete tactical victory for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and their allies. Warriors sang victory songs that night. They mourned their own dead, maybe 30 or 40 killed, though accounts vary. They celebrated the fulfillment of Sitting Bull's vision, soldiers falling upside down into their camp. They'd defended their families. They'd protected their way of life. They'd proven that courage and skill could defeat the Army's technology and numbers. But even as they celebrated, some of the older warriors knew the truth. This victory would bring terrible consequences. The American public would demand revenge. The Army would come back with more soldiers, more weapons, more determination. You could win every battle and still lose the war when your enemy could replace casualties faster than you could count them. Young Black Elk remembered his elders talking quietly that night. Some said they should scatter, break into small bands, hide in the mountains. Others said they should stay together, strength in numbers. Sitting Bull said they should move north toward Canada, toward safety. But the debate continued, and while they debated, the military machine was already mobilizing. General William Tecumseh Sherman, commanding general of the Army, received news of the Little Bighorn and immediately ordered reinforcements to the northern plains. Thousands of additional troops, new weapons, a winter campaign if necessary. Whatever it took to crush the Lakota resistance once and for all, the Battle of the Little Bighorn was the Lakota's greatest victory. It was also the beginning of their end. Because you can't defeat industrial warfare with courage and tactical brilliance. You can win battles. You can inflict casualties. You can fight with skill and bravery that deserves respect across generations. But when your enemy can bring 5,000 soldiers for everyone you kill, when they can manufacture weapons faster than you can capture them, when they have railroads and telegraphs and an industrial economy behind them, eventually, the arithmetic of warfare catches up with you. The summer of 1876 was the last time the Lakota stood as a free people on their own land. masters of their own destiny, capable of defeating the United States military in open battle. Within a few years, most would be on reservations. Within 2 decades, their children would be in boarding schools. Within a generation, the buffalo would be gone. But for one shining moment in June 1876, on a hillside above the Little Bighorn River, warriors proved that courage and skill and knowledge of the land could overcome superior technology. They proved that people fighting for their homes and families were more formidable than professional soldiers following orders. They proved that Sitting Bull's vision was true. The soldiers fell into their camp and they didn't survive. It was their greatest triumph, and it sealed their doom. Because America doesn't lose gracefully, and the response to the Little Bighorn would be overwhelming, relentless, and ultimately devastating. The mechanical thunder was coming, and this time, no amount of courage would be enough to stop it. The summer after the Little Bighorn, the great camp scattered. Not because they were defeated. They just won the most decisive victory in Plains Indian history. They scattered because that's what they always did. Summer was for gathering. Fall and winter were for splitting into smaller bands that could find sheltered valleys, hunt efficiently, and survive the brutal prairie winters. It was the pattern that had worked for generations, but this time the pattern would destroy them. Because General William Tecumseh Sherman and General Philip Sheridan had learned from the Little Bighorn. They wouldn't chase large concentrations of warriors across the plains in summer when Indians had every advantage. They would hunt scattered bands in winter when mobility was limited, when people were vulnerable, when the cold was as deadly as any weapon. Colonel Nelson Miles arrived in Montana Territory with fresh troops and new orders. Constant pressure. He didn't wait for spring campaigning season. He pursued bands through snow and ice. When warriors tried to rest, he attacked. When camps tried to find peace in sheltered valleys, his scouts found them. It was relentless, grinding warfare designed to exhaust rather than destroy, and it worked. By the winter of 1876 to 77, bands started surrendering. Not because they were beaten in battle, they weren't, but because they were tired, hungry, running out of ammunition, watching their children shiver in lodges that couldn't keep out the wind. You can't fight when your people are starving. You can't maintain warrior societies when you spend every day searching for game that's becoming scarce because buffalo herds are fragmenting. Under the pressure of constant military operations, Crazy Horse held out longer than most. Through the winter of 1876, through the spring of 1877, he kept his band free, moving through the Powder River country, avoiding army columns. But he was leading maybe 300 people, and the circle was closing. Scouts tracked him constantly. Soldiers appeared wherever he went. Former allies were surrendering, and sometimes helping the army locate holdouts in exchange for better treatment. On May 6th, 1877, Crazy Horse rode into Fort Robinson in Nebraska and surrendered. He came with about 300 followers, men, women, and children. Warriors who'd followed him through years of fighting. People who trusted him to lead them to safety when fighting was no longer possible. Crazy Horse handed over his weapons and his horses and accepted confinement to the Red Cloud Agency. 4 months later, on September 5th, army officers tried to arrest him, claiming he was planning to flee. There was a struggle. A soldier, accounts differ on who, stabbed Crazy Horse with a bayonet. The wound penetrated his kidney. He died that night, 36 or 37 years old, in a guardhouse while his father sat outside singing death songs. The warrior who'd never been wounded in battle, who'd ridden through gunfire untouched, died from a wound received while surrendering. Sitting Bull chose a different path. After the Little Bighorn, he led his followers north toward Canada, Grandmother's Land they called it, referring to Queen Victoria. Hundreds of Lakota crossed the border in late 1876 and early 1877, seeking refuge beyond the reach of the U.S. Army. The Canadian government tolerated them, but provided no support. No rations, no supplies. Just permission to stay as long as they caused no trouble. For 4 years, Sitting Bull's band survived in Canada by hunting whatever game they could find. But the buffalo were vanishing there too. The great herds that had sustained Plains Indians for generations were being systematically destroyed. White hunters with powerful rifles were killing buffalo by the millions, not for meat, just for hides. 50 buffalo killed for 50 hides, the carcasses left to rot. 1,000 buffalo killed in a day by a single hunter with a Sharps rifle. The destruction was deliberate policy. General Sheridan said it openly. Destroy the buffalo, and you destroy the Indians' food supply, their clothing, their lodges, their entire way of life. Starve them into submission. It was total warfare, applied not against warriors, but against an entire ecosystem. By 1881, Sitting Bull's people were desperate. Children were dying of malnutrition. Adults were skin and bones. The Canadian government made clear they wouldn't provide aid. On July 19, 1881, Sitting Bull crossed back into the United States and surrendered at Fort Butte in Montana Territory. The great holy man who'd envisioned the Little Bighorn, who'd cut 100 pieces of flesh in sacrifice, who'd led his people to the greatest victory in their history. He surrendered because his children were starving. The army kept him prisoner for 2 years as punishment for the Little Bighorn. When they finally released him, he went to Standing Rock Reservation in Dakota Territory, where Indian agents watched his every move, trying to diminish his influence, forbidding him from leaving without permission. But let's back up to 1890, because that's when the real catastrophe happened. That's when hope and desperation combined to produce the Ghost Dance movement. And that's when the mechanical thunder came to Wounded Knee Creek. The Ghost Dance started with a Paiute holy man named Wovoka in Nevada. He had a vision during a solar eclipse in January 1889. In the vision, he saw a world where white people disappeared, where the buffalo returned, where dead ancestors came back to life, where Native Americans lived as they had before Europeans arrived. All people had to do was dance the ghost dance, sing the sacred songs, and believe. Some versions added that special ghost shirts decorated with sacred symbols would protect dancers from bullets. The ghost dance spread across the plains like wildfire. Desperate people seized on it with the fervor of those who have nothing left to lose. On reservations, where starvation rations kept people barely alive, where corrupt agents stole government supplies and sold them for profit, where former warriors wore cast-off army uniforms because their own clothes had worn out, the ghost dance offered hope. Not hope for accommodation or gradual improvement, hope for miraculous transformation. Lakota people danced through the fall of 1890, circles of hundreds dancing for days at a time until exhaustion brought visions. People claimed to see dead relatives, claimed to see buffalo herds returning, claimed to see the whites disappearing like snow melting in spring. Indian agents panicked. They saw thousands of Indians dancing, singing, working themselves into what looked like religious ecstasy, and they feared an uprising. Sitting Bull supported the ghost dance, not because he necessarily believed in the specific prophecy. He was too experienced, too pragmatic, but because he believed people had the right to practice their religion. When James McLaughlin, the Indian agent at Standing Rock, ordered him to stop the dances, Sitting Bull refused. So McLaughlin decided to arrest him. On December 15, 1890, Indian police, Lakota men working for the agency, surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin before dawn. They dragged him outside. A crowd gathered, warriors who still followed the old chief. His son Crowfoot, 14 years old, taunted his father for submitting without a fight. Sitting Bull hesitated, perhaps thinking about resistance. One of the Indian police shot him in the head. More shots rang out. When it ended, Sitting Bull lay dead in the dirt outside his home, killed by his own people working for the government. Hundreds of Minneconjou Lakota, terrified by Sitting Bull's murder, fled Standing Rock Reservation and headed south toward Pine Ridge, hoping to find safety. They were led by Chief Bigfoot, who was sick with pneumonia. The army pursued them. On December 28, 1890, soldiers from the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old unit, intercepted Bigfoot's band at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. There were about 350 Lakota. About two-thirds were women and children. They were cold, hungry, sick, and trying to reach Pine Ridge to surrender peacefully. The army surrounded them with 500 soldiers and positioned 4 Hotchkiss guns on a hill overlooking the camp. Hotchkiss guns. We need to talk about these weapons because they're crucial to understanding what happened next. A Hotchkiss gun was essentially an improved Gatling gun. It could fire explosive shells at a rate of 43 rounds per minute. 43, that's a shell exploding in your camp every 1.4 seconds. These weren't just bullets. These were shells that detonated on impact, sending shrapnel in all directions. One shell could kill or wound multiple people. The Hotchkiss guns were positioned to have clear fields of fire across the entire camp. On the morning of December 29th, soldiers entered the camp to confiscate weapons. The Lakota had few weapons left, and most were old. The soldiers searched roughly, rifling through personal belongings, treating people with disrespect. Tensions rose. A medicine man named Yellowbird danced and sang ghost dance songs, reminding people that their sacred shirts would protect them from bullets. A soldier tried to take a rifle from a deaf warrior named Black Coyote. Black Coyote had paid a lot for that rifle. It represented significant wealth. He held on to it. In the struggle, the rifle discharged. One shot, maybe accidental, maybe deliberate. But that single shot was all it took. Soldiers opened fire point blank into the crowd. The Hotchkiss guns on the hill began firing into the camp. 43 rounds per minute per gun, 4 guns. Over 170 shells per minute exploding among lodges, among families, among people who'd been sitting peacefully moments before. The mechanical thunder had come to Wounded Knee. Louise Weasel Bear was 19 years old. She watched soldiers shoot her mother, who was carrying a baby on her back. Both died instantly. Louise ran with other survivors toward a ravine, thinking they'd find cover. The Hotchkiss guns tracked them. Shells exploded in the ravine. Bodies piled up. Children screamed. Women threw themselves over their children, trying to shield them with their bodies. The killing lasted perhaps 30 minutes. When it stopped, approximately 300 Lakota lay dead or dying in the snow. Two-thirds were women and children. Some had been killed in the initial volley. Others were hunted down trying to flee. Bodies were found up to 2 miles from the camp, shot in the back while running. The army lost 25 soldiers, mostly from friendly fire when they shot each other in the chaos. They later awarded 20 medals of honor for the action at Wounded Knee. 20, the highest military decoration in the United States given for valor in combat. For shooting women and children who were trying to surrender, a blizzard moved in that night. Bodies froze in the positions where they died. Mothers shielding children. Old men who'd stopped running because they couldn't run anymore. Warriors who'd tried to fight back with the few weapons they had. 3 days later, when the weather cleared, burial parties arrived. They found some wounded still alive, frozen but alive, sheltered by dead bodies. A baby girl was found nursing at her dead mother's breast, alive because her mother's body had protected her from the cold. The burial party dug a mass grave on the hill where the Hotchkiss guns had stood. They threw the frozen bodies in without ceremony. 84 men and boys, 44 women, 18 children under 12. Those are the ones they bothered to count. There were more. Bodies scattered across the prairie, in ravines in the creek. Some were never recovered. Soldiers posed for photographs at the mass grave. Some of those photographs survive. You can see the burial pit, the frozen bodies. The soldiers standing around looking at the camera, some smiling. It's one of the most haunting images in American history. Black Elk was 27 years old in December 1890. He'd survived the Little Bighorn as a boy. He'd seen the golden age of Lakota power. He'd watched it end. After Wounded Knee, he said, "I can see that something else died there in the bloody mud and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream. The nation's hoop is broken and scattered. There is no center any longer, and the sacred tree is dead. The ghost shirts didn't stop bullets. The prophecy didn't come true. The buffalo didn't return. The dead ancestors stayed dead. The whites didn't disappear. What disappeared was the last hope that things could somehow return to the way they were. That courage and faith and ceremony could restore what had been lost. The Wounded Knee massacre, and it was a massacre, not a battle, broke something fundamental in the Lakota spirit. Not permanently, as we'll see, but in that moment, in that winter they called the death song Winter, it seemed like the end of everything. The warriors who defeated Custer were dead or confined to reservations. The buffalo were gone. The children were being taken to boarding schools. The ceremonies were illegal. The language was forbidden. And the mechanical thunder of the Hotchkiss guns had proven what many had feared since the Little Bighorn, that courage couldn't defeat industrial warfare, that medicine shirts couldn't stop explosive shells, that a people armed with bows and old rifles couldn't stand against an army with unlimited resources and weapons that could fire 170 rounds per minute, wounded. Knee was the end of the Plains Indian Wars, the last military action between the U.S. Army and Native Americans. But more than that, it was a demonstration of what happens when industrial military power is turned against civilians without restraint. It was a preview of 20th century warfare, where technology makes killing efficient and distance makes it easier to forget that you're killing human beings. The sacred hoop was broken. The tree was dead. The dream was buried in the snow at Wounded Knee Creek, or so it seemed. But dreams, like grass, have a way of surviving winter. And the story of the Lakota people didn't end at Wounded Knee, even though it might have seemed that way on December 29th, 1890, when the mechanical thunder finally stopped and the only sound was the wind blowing across the frozen bodies of people who'd believed they're sacred. Shirts would protect them. The reservation system wasn't designed to help Native Americans transition to a new way of life. Let's be clear about that from the start. It was designed to contain them, control them, and ultimately make them disappear, not through direct violence like Wounded Knee, but through slower, more bureaucratic forms of destruction. Cultural genocide is the term historians use now. But to the people living through it, it was just survival, day by day, year by year, watching everything that made them who they were being stripped away. Picture Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota in the 1890s. Thousands of Lakota confined to land that couldn't support them through traditional means. The buffalo were gone, not scattered, not temporarily absent, but extinct in the wild by the mid-1880s. Maybe a few hundred survived in captivity, but the herds that had sustained Plains Indians for centuries were obliterated. 30 million buffalo reduced to nearly zero in about 15 years. That's not natural decline. That's industrial-scale destruction. Without buffalo, the Lakota depended on government rations promised by treaty. And here's where corruption became a form of violence. Indian agents were political appointees, often given their positions as rewards for loyalty rather than competence or integrity. They controlled the rations. They controlled the distribution. And many of them saw the reservation system as an opportunity for personal profit. James McLaughlin at Standing Rock, the man who'd ordered Sitting Bull's arrest, was relatively honest by reservation agent standards, which tells you how low that bar was. Other agents were openly corrupt. They were supposed to distribute beef cattle, flour, sugar, coffee. Instead, they'd issue maybe half what was allocated and sell the rest to white merchants, pocketing the money. They'd deliver spoiled meat, carcasses so rotten people got sick eating them, flour infested with weevils, coffee that was mostly dirt, people starved. Not dramatically, not all at once, but chronic malnutrition became the norm. Children grew up stunted. Adults became susceptible to diseases they might have fought off with better nutrition. Tuberculosis ravaged reservation populations. So did measles, influenza, whooping cough. Diseases that were inconvenient to white Americans killed Native Americans in huge numbers because their bodies were weakened by hunger. And through all this, the government's stated goal was assimilation. The Lakota would become civilized. They would adopt Christianity, farming, European dress, and American names. They would stop being Indian and become, in the words of Indian Affairs policy, productive members of society. But here's the thing about forced assimilation. It requires destroying what came before. You can't make people into something new without taking away the old. So the government made Lakota culture illegal. Actually illegal. The Sundance, forbidden. Caught performing it, you went to jail. Giveaway ceremonies? Forbidden. Those demonstrated improper attachment to communal rather than individual property. Traditional medicine practices. Forbidden. Those were primitive superstitions that prevented proper medical care. Never mind that reservation doctors were scarce and often incompetent. Even the language was illegal in certain contexts. Speak Lakota in school. Punishment. Teach your children Lakota instead of English. Government agents would threaten to withhold rations. The goal was linguistic extinction. Make the language die with the current generation, and the culture dies too, because language carries culture in ways that are hard to articulate but profound. Stories, jokes, ways of thinking about the world. All of it encoded in vocabulary and grammar that doesn't translate cleanly to English. And then there were the boarding schools. Here's where federal policy became truly horrific in its implications. Starting in the 1880s, the government began forcibly removing Native American children from their families and sending them to boarding schools, sometimes hundreds or thousands of miles away. The model was Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, founded by Richard Henry Pratt in 1879. Pratt had a slogan, "Kill the Indian, save the man." He meant it as compassionate. He genuinely believed he was helping Native American children by stripping away their culture and replacing it with white American culture. That he was preparing them for success in the only world that would exist going forward. That their parents' way of life was doomed, so better to transform children completely than let them cling to a dying culture. The reality was traumatic on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Imagine you're a Lakota child, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Men in uniforms appear at your family's cabin. They might give your parents some warning, might not. They take you and your siblings, put you on a wagon, then a train. You've maybe never seen a train before. The journey takes days. You arrive at a massive stone building unlike anything in your experience. They cut your hair. For boys, this was especially traumatic because in Lakota culture, you only cut your hair in mourning. Long hair represented strength, life, connection to tradition. School officials cut it with sheep shears like you were livestock. The hair fell to the floor, and with it went part of your identity. They gave you new clothes, uniforms, stiff, uncomfortable, nothing like the soft leather and cloth you were used to. Boys got military-style uniforms. Girls got long dresses in styles decades out of fashion in white society, but deemed appropriate for civilizing Indians. They gave you a new name, not a translation of your Lakota name. A random English name, John, Mary, Sarah, Thomas, names with no meaning, no connection to family or deeds or visions. You became whoever the intake officer decided you should be, then the rules. Speak English only. Any Lakota word earned punishment. Stand in the corner, skip meals. Physical beatings. Some teachers and administrators were genuinely cruel, using their authority to abuse children with no oversight or accountability. Others were simply implementing policy, convinced they were helping even as children cried themselves to sleep every night. The schools taught basic literacy and arithmetic, but also vocational skills deemed appropriate for Indians. Boys learned farming and manual trades, blacksmithing, carpentry, shoemaking. They were training to be laborers, not professionals. Girls learned cooking, sewing, and domestic service. They were training to be maids and housewives. The education was designed to produce compliant workers for the lowest rungs of white society. Children spent years away from family. Some never returned, dying of disease in school and buried in cemetery plots far from home. Some returned so changed their parents barely recognized them. They spoke English but had forgotten Lakota. They'd absorbed Christian morality and found traditional spirituality uncomfortable. They didn't fit in reservation communities anymore, but they didn't fit in white society either. They existed in a painful liminal space, belonging nowhere, but resistance persisted. It had to persist, or everything would have been lost. And resistance took forms that government agents couldn't easily suppress. Old men like Black Elk, who'd survived the Little Bighorn as a boy and Wounded Knee as a young man, kept the sacred pipes. They hid them from agents. They performed ceremonies in secret, in remote valleys where patrols wouldn't find them. Young men would slip away from the reservation, ostensibly to hunt or visit relatives, and in hidden places they'd dance the sun dance, the piercings, the prayers, the visions, all illegal, all potentially grounds for imprisonment, but necessary to maintain the thread of tradition. Women became crucial in this resistance because much of what they did wasn't obviously ceremonial. Beadwork, for instance. Government agents saw it as craft, maybe something to sell to tourists, but beadwork carried patterns passed down through generations. Each design was a mnemonic device, a way of encoding history and teaching. A woman could teach her daughter traditional stories through the patterns on moccasins, and to outsiders it looked like she was just teaching sewing. Quillwork similarly preserved knowledge. The geometric patterns, the color combinations, the specific techniques, all of it carried meaning. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter quillwork was teaching her to be Lakota in ways that didn't require language or ceremony. The knowledge passed through hands and eyes and practice, too subtle for authorities to recognize, too embedded in daily life to be easily forbidden. Winter counts continued. These were pictographic calendars painted on buffalo hide, or later on canvas or muslin when buffalo hide became unavailable. Each year received a symbol representing the most significant event. The year the stars fell, the Leonid meteor shower of 1833, the year they killed Sitting Bull, the year the children were taken to school. The winter count was history, maintained visually, passing from keeper to keeper across generations. The reservation years recorded in winter counts are a catalogue of suffering. The year of the spotted sickness, smallpox. The year rations stopped coming. The year of the big snow, when people froze because they couldn't gather firewood. The year when the agent burned all the medicine bundles he could find. Each symbol represents countless personal tragedies, families destroyed, traditions interrupted, but also acts of preservation. The year Old Man Chips performed the Sundance in the Badlands. The year the women hid the sacred pipe from the agent's search. The year 3 boys ran away from boarding school and made it home. These acts of resistance, small but significant, keeping the thread of culture alive through the darkest period of Lakota history. Some Lakota found unexpected ways to resist through participation in white society. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, for instance. Started in 1883, it was part circus, part history pageant, part racist fantasy. It portrayed Indians as savage warriors from a bygone era, putting on demonstrations of riding, shooting, and mock battles for audiences in America and Europe. But for Lakota participants, it meant money to send home to families. It meant travel, seeing cities, meeting people, understanding the scale of white society in ways that staying on the reservation never could. And it meant preserving skills. You couldn't practice warrior riding and shooting on the reservation without drawing suspicion from agents. But in Buffalo Bill's show, you could do exactly those things, maintaining traditions under the guise of entertainment. Sitting Bull toured with Buffalo Bill in 1885. He used the money he earned to help poor families on Standing Rock Reservation. He met audiences across America, and some sources say he'd respond to their applause by cursing them in Lakota, which his interpreter would translate as thanks and appreciation. True or not, the story captures the complicated position of performing your culture for people who destroyed that culture. The reservation years also saw the Dawes Act of 1887, another federal attempt to destroy tribal identity. The act broke up communally held reservation land and allocated individual plots to Native Americans, 160 acres per family head. The idea was to make them farmers, property owners, individualists rather than communalists. The reality was that much of the land wasn't suitable for farming. Even when it was, people often had no training, no equipment, no capital to start farming operations. And here's the kicker. Any reservation land left over after allocations could be sold to white settlers, which meant millions of acres of reservation land ended up in white hands. The Lakota lost about half their remaining land under the Dawes Act, land that had been guaranteed by treaty that they'd already sacrificed so much to keep, was simply taken by legislative action and redistributed. Through all this, families endured. That's what gets me about the reservation period. It would have been easy, maybe understandable, to give up, to let the culture die because holding on was so hard and the rewards were so minimal. But people didn't give up. Parents taught children what they could. Elders told stories. Medicine men kept the ceremonies alive in secret. Women preserved the arts and crafts that carried tradition. The government's goal was extinction, cultural extinction, achieved through assimilation, education, Christianization, and the breaking down of communal ties. Many agents genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They'd look at starving children on reservations and think, these people need to become like us. They couldn't or wouldn't see that starvation was caused by government policy, not Lakota culture. By the 1920s, casual observers might have concluded the experiment succeeded. Lakota people wore American clothes, spoke English, sent their children to school, went to church. The visible markers of traditional culture had largely disappeared from public life. Reservations looked like poor rural American communities, just with brown faces instead of white ones, but underneath, in homes and hearts, in hidden valleys and quiet moments, the culture survived, diminished, damaged, carrying trauma that would echo for generations. But alive. The pipe ceremonies continued in secret. The stories were still told. The beadwork still carried the old patterns. The language persisted despite all efforts to kill it, kept alive by grandmothers who'd learned it before boarding schools existed and taught it to grandchildren when agents weren't watching. And that persistence, that refusal to disappear, that stubborn maintenance of identity despite every effort to extinguish it, that's the story of the reservation years. Not just suffering, though there was tremendous suffering. Not just loss, though the losses were catastrophic, but also resistance, survival, the determination to remain Lakota even when being Lakota was illegal, inconvenient and dangerous. The sacred tree was cut down at Wounded Knee, but trees grow from roots, and the roots survived underground, waiting for a time when they could safely grow again. That time was coming, though people living through the reservation years had no way of knowing it. They just held on, day by day, generation after generation, keeping alive the ember of tradition, waiting for the day when it might become a flame again. World War I, 1917. The United States enters the war, and recruitment begins across the country. On reservations throughout the Great Plains, young Lakota men, many of them sons and grandsons of warriors who'd fought Custer, who'd survived Wounded Knee, who'd been told their culture was savage and their warrior. Traditions were barbaric. These young men volunteered for military service in astonishing numbers, not because they'd forgotten what the United States had done to their people. You don't forget Wounded Knee. You don't forget boarding schools and stolen land and starvation rations. They volunteered because being a warrior was still part of who they were, even after decades of suppression. The warrior societies might be illegal, the ceremonies might be forbidden, but the identity persisted, and when war came, warriors volunteered. Lakota soldiers served with distinction in World War I and even more prominently in World War II. They earned medals per capita at rates higher than any other group. They used their native language as code in combat communications. The very language the government had tried to eradicate became a military asset because enemy forces couldn't decipher it. And when they returned home, they brought veteran status that gave them new standing, new authority to advocate for their communities. The warrior societies revived. Officially, they were veteran organizations. Legally, they couldn't be banned because they were affiliated with military service. But they functioned as traditional warrior societies had, providing structure, honor, and purpose to young men. The Kit Foxes and Stronghearts re-emerged under new names, but with old traditions. Veterans held giveaway ceremonies, honoring their service by giving to the community just as warriors had always done. But let me jump ahead to 1973, because that's when the Lakota made international headlines again. Not through accommodation or gradual progress, but through confrontation. The American Indian Movement, AM, led by activists including Russell Means and Dennis Banks, decided to make a statement. They chose Wounded Knee, the place where the dream died in 1890, the place where Hotchkiss guns had massacred families, the place that symbolized everything that had been done to Native Americans. On February 27, 1973, AIM activists occupied the town of Wounded Knee on Pine Ridge Reservation. They declared it liberated territory. They issued demands: honor the treaties, investigate corruption on reservations, address the desperate poverty and violence that plagued reservation communities. The occupation lasted 71 days. Federal marshals and FBI agents surrounded Wounded Knee. Armored personnel carriers, automatic weapons, the modern equivalent of the 7th Cavalry surrounding a Lakota camp. Except this time, the world was watching. Television cameras captured the standoff. Reporters interviewed the occupiers. The contrast between heavily armed federal forces and Native American activists was stark and uncomfortable for American audiences. There were firefights. 2 activists died. A federal marshal was shot and paralyzed. The occupation ended with negotiations rather than a massacre, though the government charged many participants with crimes. But here's what mattered. Wounded Knee became a rallying point. Young Native Americans across the country saw people standing up, demanding justice, refusing to accept continued oppression. The occupation didn't solve the underlying problems, but it announced that Native Americans weren't going away quietly, weren't accepting their assigned role as vanishing victims of manifest destiny. And then there's the Black Hills claim. Remember, the Pahasapa, the sacred center of Lakota spirituality, were guaranteed to the Lakota in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. When gold was discovered in 1874, that treaty was violated. Miners flooded in. The army protected them. The land was taken. In 1923, Lakota leaders filed a claim for the Black Hills. The legal process took decades. Through the courts, through appeals, through bureaucratic processes that seemed designed to exhaust claimants rather than deliver justice. But Lakota lawyers and activists persisted. In 1980, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the taking of the Black Hills was illegal. The government owed compensation. The court calculated the value of the land in 1877 when it was taken, plus interest. By 1980, that totaled about $106 million. Today, with continued interest accumulation, it's over $1 billion. The largest financial settlement ever offered to a Native American tribe. The government was ready to pay. The case was settled. Take the money. Move on. The Lakota refused. They refuse to this day. The money sits in a government account, accumulating interest unclaimed. Because to accept the money would be to accept that the Black Hills are for sale, that they were legitimately taken, that the theft becomes legal through compensation. The Lakota position is clear. The Black Hills were never for sale. They remain sacred. They remain Lakota land, regardless of who claims legal jurisdiction. The government can keep its money. The hills are not for sale. Think about what that means. $1 billion? That's transformative wealth for communities struggling with poverty rates among the highest in the nation. That money could build schools, hospitals, housing, could fund education and economic development. But accepting it would mean surrendering the claim to the land itself, and the land is more important than money. It's an extraordinary statement of values in a society that often assumes everything has a price. Meanwhile, cultural revival has accelerated over the past 50 years. The Sun Dance, illegal until 1978, now happens openly every summer on Pine Ridge and Rosebud reservations. Thousands attend. Warriors still pierce their chests with eagle bone skewers, still dance until the flesh tears free, still seek visions and make offerings. The ceremony that federal agents tried to destroy has returned, and veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan pierce alongside their grandfathers who remember when the ceremony had to be hidden. Language revitalization programs have started across Lakota reservations. Immersion schools where children learn in Lakota, where English is the second language, where the goal is to create fluent speakers who can pass the language to the next generation. It's harder now than it would have been in 1900. There are fewer fluent speakers, more competing influences, more reasons to prioritize English. But the work continues because language is identity, and losing the language means losing part of what makes the Lakota distinct. Buffalo have returned to tribal lands, not in the millions like the old herds, but in growing numbers. Tribes have established buffalo preservation programs, managing herds that serve both practical and spiritual purposes. Young people learn to hunt buffalo again, learning the prayers and protocols that their great-great-grandparents knew. It's a small echo of what was, but it's an echo that grows stronger each year. Contemporary Lakota artists, writers, and filmmakers tell new stories while honoring old ones. Poet Layli Long Soldier writes in both Lakota and English, exploring the complexity of indigenous identity in modern America. Her work has won major literary awards, bringing Lakota perspectives to audiences that might never visit a reservation. Filmmaker Chris Eyre, who grew up on Pine Ridge, makes movies that show reservation life from the inside, the humor, the struggle, the resilience that outsiders often miss. Activist Madonna Thunderhawk has spent decades organizing for indigenous rights, connecting traditional knowledge to modern political action. She's in her 80s now, but she links the generations, old enough to remember when many ceremonies were still illegal, young enough in spirit to continue fighting for change. She represents the continuity, the thread that connects the warriors who fought Custer to the activists occupying Wounded Knee, to the young people learning Lakota in immersion schools today. The reservations remain poor by American standards. Unemployment on Pine Ridge often exceeds 50%. Life expectancy is among the lowest in the United States. Addiction, suicide, and violence plague communities. The historical trauma of boarding schools, massacres, forced relocations, and cultural suppression doesn't just disappear because ceremonies are legal again. It echoes through generations, affecting how people relate to each other, how they parent, how they cope with stress. But alongside the trauma is resilience. Communities that survived everything the United States threw at them. Military campaigns, starvation, disease, forced assimilation, child removal, cultural suppression are still here. Still Lakota, still speaking the language, even if fewer speak it fluently. Still performing the ceremonies, even if they had to be hidden for decades. Still teaching the children about Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, about the Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee, about what it means to be Lakota in an era when being Lakota requires conscious effort and active resistance to assimilation. The sacred hoop, broken at Wounded Knee, has been mending, not back to what it was. You can't undo history. Can't resurrect the buffalo herds, or restore the pristine plains, or bring back the golden age when Lakota warriors were the undisputed masters of the northern Great Plains. But you can maintain identity. You can preserve language and ceremony and values. You can adapt traditional culture to modern circumstances while keeping the core intact. Young Lakota people navigate multiple worlds today. They might speak English at school, Lakota at home with grandparents. They might serve in the U.S. military and participate in sundances. They might work in contemporary jobs while maintaining traditional responsibilities to family and community. The complexity is challenging, but it's also evidence of survival. Culture isn't static. It adapts or it dies. The Lakota culture has adapted while maintaining continuity with the past. And here's what gets me about this story. The Lakota had every reason to disappear. Federal policy was explicitly designed to make them disappear. The military tried to destroy them. The boarding schools tried to erase their culture. The reservation system tried to contain and control them until they simply became another ethnic minority absorbed into American society. And they refused. They refused through resistance, sometimes dramatic and sometimes quiet. Through the grandmother teaching beadwork by firelight. Through the old man hiding the sacred pipe. Through the young warriors volunteering for World War I and coming home as veterans with new status. Through the activists occupying Wounded Knee, through the lawyers pursuing the Black Hills claim for decades, through the language teachers and the buffalo keepers and the sun dancers, what Gatling guns couldn't destroy at Wounded Knee, what boarding schools couldn't erase through child removal, what starvation rations and cultural suppression couldn't eliminate, the fundamental identity of being Lakota survives. Damaged, yes. Changed, certainly. Carrying trauma and loss that will affect generations to come. Absolutely. But alive, present, looking toward a future while honoring the past. The prophecy of the ghost dance didn't come true. The white people didn't disappear. The buffalo didn't return by millions. The dead didn't rise. But neither did the Lakota vanish, as so many predicted and some intended. They're still here, still Lakota. And that persistence, that refusal to become extinct or to simply blend into American society and lose distinctiveness, that's the final chapter of this story. Or maybe it's not the final chapter. Maybe it's just the latest chapter in a story that continues to unfold. Because the Lakota Nation exists today not as a historical curiosity or a museum piece, but as living communities with real challenges and real strengths, with connections to the past and aspirations for the future. The warriors who rode with Crazy Horse would hardly recognize the world their descendants inhabit, but they might recognize the spirit, the determination to remain Lakota, to maintain identity, to pass on the traditions, even when the world seems set against you. From the darkness of Wind Cave, where the people first emerged, through the golden age when they were lords of the endless grass, through the wars and the massacres and the reservation years, through occupation and revival and ongoing struggle, the thread continues. The sacred hoop, though broken, is being mended. The tree, though it seemed dead at Wounded Knee, grows again from roots that survived underground. The eagles that gave the Lakota strength in the old days still soar above the Black Hills, and the people below them are still there, still watching, still Lakota. That's the unconquered spirit. Not that they never lost battles. They lost many. Not that they weren't hurt. They were devastated. But that they survived, adapted, persisted, and remained distinct. After everything, despite everything. The Lakota are still here, and that might be the most important victory of all.